Question for you. What responsibility do big technology companies have to pass on the information that they have about us to police who are investigating crimes? Specifically, mobile phone companies, Apple. They have all sorts of information about their users because people use their services, the cloud and so on, to save contacts, to save pictures, to save messages. What if police want to access that information as part of an investigation? Of course, they need to obtain a warrant and do all that sort of thing. But there's a really interesting story in The Australian this morning by Mark Schliebs that says that Australian agencies, including counter-terrorism and child abuse units in state police forces, apparently they've made more than 770 requests for information from Apple since January 2013 relating to information that's stored on their users' accounts. How many times do you reckon they have had success in getting that information? 0. That's quite remarkable. Is it right? Well, my next guest on the program has some experience in this area. These days he runs an organisation called Surf Online Safe, but he's a former WA copper who was intimately involved in these sorts of investigations. His name's Paul Litherland. G'day, Paul.
Hi, Gareth. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for your time today. What do you make of this story?
Oh, this is probably a typical sort of frustration met by most law enforcement across the country in regards to trying to access these details. Sadly, it's been going on for a while now, and it's good that I suppose this type of article and the arguments that's been coming out of the US and Apple since early 2016 is starting to get some good momentum now, because I don't think. Well, I know the vast majority of the public are completely unaware that they can refuse such information from law enforcement.
So when you were in the WA Police Force investigating these sorts of things, was this your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't only in WA, but across most WA agencies. It's just so it's impossible to get information out of the large organisations because they're very protective of that information, Gareth. So providing, even under warrant, providing certain information, you were lucky, but in regards to access and data on the device, it was always going to be difficult because of the legislation that's not in place to provide that information.
Okay, so what's the usual process that a police officer or an investigator might go through to try and get information?
Okay, without giving too much information around regards to protocols, obviously, but as an example, you'd send an email through to federal police, and then the federal police would send off that same request to Apple, to Samsung, to Facebook, or whoever you wanted that information from, as an example. And depending on the level of information provided, that would either go with just a standard request in an email, or it would go with an international subpoena or a warrant. So in the case probably explained here in this article from the Australian, it's quite a serious case. So you'd probably assume that was sent with a warrant of some sort. But again, it's getting these organisations to be compelled under law to abide by that warrant is where most of the difficulties come into play, because they just won't do it.
Paul, part of the problem here seems to be that Apple believe that they're compelled to comply with US law, and in fact, it seems like reading this story that similar requests to the type of ones that we're discussing this morning have actually been acceded to for US law enforcement, but perhaps Apple not taking the same attitude when it comes to Australia.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and even Gareth, if you realise that, once you realise that Apple were knocking back requests from the FBI, as a WA police officer, as a local copper here in WA, you'd sit there and go, well, we got no chance. But I think from the US's perspective, especially from Apple, this is, I suppose, much more than just a single device. This is just, they've got to consider the fact that if they're giving access to one particular device, and that can open up a whole myriad of issues for them, because then do they have to give access to every single device on the networks or whatever's being used? So this is their major argument, and so often as a police officer, not only in Australia but all over the world, external to the US, they've got very strong civil liberty laws over there. So trying to get information from users or privacy information is just almost impossible, because they are protected under legislation in the US to not provide that information. So this is where it just does get very, very difficult.
9221 882 is the number if you'd like to talk about this today. I wonder if you think that companies like Apple, and I'm sure there's other mobile phone manufacturers as well, who operate these services in conjunction with the devices that allow information to be stored, should they be more cooperative with law enforcement? I wonder if you've got a view on that. 9221 882, you can give me a call. Paul, it's not just a legislation story though either, is it? It's also about the technological encryption that these companies use on their devices. Famously in the case of the San Bernardino shooters in the US, the FBI wanted information from a particular device. Apple said, well, look, we can't unencrypt it, we won't unencrypt it. And that's another part of this debate about whether, in fact, those encryption methods should be able to be overridden. The way that the phones are designed, especially with once a user gets their phone, they've put in their own passcode, they've put in their own security details on that device, then it is actually very difficult, or almost impossible for Apple to actually do that themselves without the physical device. Yeah. And even police, for local law enforcement or techies to do that, there are ways around it, but again, it's a massive issue to do, because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort and energy. So what most law enforcement are saying is, look, wouldn't it be ideal just to ring Apple and say, look, can you give us the passcode of this device, so can we just get into it now and have a look? Yeah. That's, I believe, is never going to happen, and some would argue it shouldn't, especially Apple, because that's privacy concerns. So there are ways around it. I mean, you can ship a phone off to other parts of the world where there's some very, very intelligent and techie people who would be able to sort of get into it. But again, that takes a long time. And if you're dealing with investigations regularly where you may have 200 or 300 phones in an office, then that does take a lot of time. So I think they're just looking for a quick fix, which I think is always going to be open to argument, because there's, and even as a former tech crime police officer, I understand both sides of that argument, because, I mean, imagine if that sort of information or ability was delegated to a local police station where the officer doesn't have any real technical ability. He was able to contact Apple and say, look, I want to get into this kid's phone or this person's phone, then that could be flawed, and a whole pile of arguments could come in regards to that access. Yeah. It's an interesting point you make, and I think, as you say, it is not as straightforward as saying this should happen. I think there are two sides to it. Well, I mean, would people be surprised to learn what information can be retrieved from a phone?
Yes and no. I think most of the frustration comes in where, especially when you're dealing with the victims of crime, or and the stuff I was dealing with at Tech Crime in regards to distribution of nudes or intimate images of bullying and threats and all that sort of stuff. I think a lot of people get very frustrated at how little information is provided by most of the networks and most of these companies. So very basic information is revealed, like, I mean, maybe user details or IP address or username and address, but in reality, no. I think a lot of people are very surprised. I mean, even from my experience, people still expect to ring the police and that the coppers can pick up a phone and contact Apple or contact Facebook, contact these companies and say, can you give us information? But that's just not the case. That needs to change, in my opinion.
Okay. So, I mean, is that the extent of the changes you, like, let's say that you were in charge of crafting new legislation for the government. I mean, how far would you go?
I'd probably try to push in the fact that we need some sort of decent intermediate person or a middleman where we can, as a government organisation or as an agency, you can say, look, this is a very serious case. We need to, as much information as we can. We're not going to actually access the device ourselves, get it done by a third party. That way, what is being accessed is only relevant to that particular crime or incident, and it's not just an open slather. So where that organisation, the middleman, can then also listen to argument by the host company and listen to their arguments in regards to protection of information as well. So we need a middleman. We need something in place where it's not just a matter of, oh yeah, whatever, too bad you can't get that information. We need something in play to do that. At the moment, that's not there, and whether we can in the future or not, I don't know, but there's so much argument in regards to yes and no, Gareth, and this is why we're in this area, because every time someone says yes, let's do it, you get 100,000 people jumping up and down and saying no, that's not what we want. So it's very difficult.
Interesting discussion, Paul. Really appreciate your expertise and spending some time to explain it on the morning program today.
Thanks, mate. All the best.
Good on you. Paul Litherland, Surf Online Safe.